Good afternoon. I am pleased to be able to present the next panel, which is called The Role of the Black Intellectual in the 21st Century. My name is Jamal Watson, and I was fortunate to be able to moderate this discussion. Throughout history, black scholars have consistently provided the moral and intellectual voice to expose the viciousness of racism and white supremacy. Working in concert with civil rights activists, they have helped to amplify the historical injustices that plague America and indeed the world. This panel will explore the role of the black intellectual in the 21st century. We are fortunate to begin the conversation with Dr. Cornel West, professor at Union Theological Seminary, followed by a panel that includes Dr. Keisha Blaine, a professor at the University of Pittsburgh, Dr. Imani Perry, a professor at Princeton University, Dr. Peniel Joseph, a professor at the University of Texas at Austin, and Dr. Ibram X. Kendi, a professor at Boston University. Please welcome our panelists. Good afternoon and welcome, and thank you so much, Dr. West, for participating in this important panel. As you know, this is National Action Network's 30th anniversary, and so we are happy to have you as a participant this year.
I'm very blessed to be here, and I want to give a great salute to my dear brother Al Sharpton. He's putting a smile on his precious mother's face, Ada Richard Sharpton. He's putting a smile on Bishop Frederick Douglass Washington and Reverend William Augustus Jones and Reverend Walter Banks and so many who have helped shape him. And he's still going. His longevity, his persistence, his willingness to engage in what he calls the Christian walk, the Christian calling. And I think it surprises a lot of people when they see us together, because they figure, wait, you all go at each other's throats. You all are going at it. We laugh together. We love together. We pray together. We fight together. But we tied to a cause bigger than each and every one of us. And that's the kingdom of God, the beloved community. And if that kingdom of God is within us and everywhere we go, we're going to leave a little heaven behind, even if we have some serious critical engagement. And so I loved it, brother. My love was always much deeper than any disagreement. And we look forward to your biography, Brother Jamal.
Yes,
you've been working on that with Brother
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And last but not least, Brother Dwight McGee.
Yes.
McGee is the key for me and for Brother Sharpton. He's both of our godfathers. We saw you, of course, at the funeral of Brother Dwight's blessed mother, where Sharpton was there with myself and others. But people don't realize that in the background, there's somebody like Brother Dwight who was counseling, giving advice, wisdom, and love to both of us, as he did Jesse Jackson, a host of others. And that kind of thing probably needs to be more well known so people could understand the variety of voices within the Black freedom struggle, within the human freedom struggle. I'm sorry to go on, but I think it's important to set this context.
Yeah.
Because I think in the end, if you don't understand Brother Sharpton's Christian walk and Christian calling and Christian vocation, and my own a Christian walk and vocation, and Brother Dwight McGee as well, then you're going to miss out on a lot. You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. So Dr. West, your scholarship certainly has meant so much to so many of us, from race matters to democracy matters, to the ethical dimensions of Marxist thought, to prophecy delivering hope on a tightrope, which is one of my favorites. You have embodied, I think, the very essence of what it means to be a scholar interested in the life of the mind. But you've always been an activist too. So I'm curious, where did that come from? I imagine your parents, Irene and Clifton Lewis West Jr., has something to do with that. But also, I imagine the good folks at Shiloh Baptist Church in Sacramento, where you grew up, had something to do with it too. So can you talk a little bit about that fusion of both your scholarship with your activism?
Well, I mean, from the very beginning, brother, I am who I am because somebody loved me. The highest honor I've ever had is being the second son of Irene and Clifton, brother of Clifton, Cynthia, and Cheryl, and being a product of Shiloh Baptist Church on the chocolate side of Sacramento, Willie P. Cook and Deacon Hinton and Sarah Ray, my Sunday school teacher. These are the real sources of good in my life, and I'll never forget it till the day I die. That's my conception of revolutionary piety, what my Black nationalist brothers and sisters would call Sankofa, that you don't look forward until you connect yourself to the best of your past, your history, your heritage. And from the very beginning, I've always viewed myself as somebody who was much more of a musician, you know, a blues man in the life of the mind. And so whatever text, whatever words, whatever books, whatever records, these are always various ways in which you're trying to give back. And you see, if you're a jazz woman or a blues man, that's kenosis. You're emptying yourself. How do you empty yourself, donate yourself, sacrifice yourself, serve others, such that whatever gifts you have are something to give to others, to empower? And so my model is very much model of Sharpton. In fact, when we sat down in Harlem almost 30 years ago, first thing we did was talk about James Brown for 2 hours before we even got into politics, because James Brown was the great figure of Black culture in his day, in which he gave everything. He left the stage, he could hardly move because he was a servant artist. And see, that's a great model for intellectuals. If intellectuals could become in any way as indispensable to the Black community as musicians, we'd have that increasing political consciousness.
That's right.
People would say, hey, I can't make it without James. I can't make it without Luther. I can't make it without Coltrane. I can't make it without Sarah Vaughan. I can't make it without Mary J. I can't make it without these intellectuals. I got to read their text. I got to see what they're thinking about, you see. And so the musicians have always been really the real benchmarks for me in terms of my own sense of calling as a intellectual, my brother.
Yeah. So are you encouraged by what you're seeing out in the field in terms of intellectuals engaging with writing about social justice issues? Are you encouraged by that?
Well, not really though, man. We live in a moment of such pervasive spiritual decay and moral decrepitude that the market has taken over everything. So everybody's for sale. Everything is for sale. The university is highly commodified. So it's more a question of everybody engaged in different strategies for access to find a niche. And the stress on service is downplayed. You see, and in such a market culture, there's not a premium on courage, on sacrifice, on taking a risk, on living and dying for something.
Yeah.
You see, that's different. You see, Sinclair Drake and the others, you know, when they were, these folk, I mean, we got towering figures, you know, Lorraine Hansberry, Paul Robeson, Du Bois. You know, we don't have figures like that in the way in which we ought, because they were willing to give everything, to sacrifice. They sacrificed their careers. They sacrificed their time, their energies. We don't have enough folk like that. Too many of these days are just enamored of the market, the spectacle, the status, the position, and lose sight of the calling and the vocation. Now, of course, we got some on this panel.
Yeah.
See, many others. I mean, I don't want to downplay it, but I do think that we have to acknowledge the degree to which we live in the most commodified culture in the history of the world. The history of the world, and it affects Black people. It affects the souls of Black people. So people have brands rather than causes. I don't have no goddamn brand at all. I got a cause. God is not a brand.
Yeah.
Black people's struggle is not a brand. The needs of Black people are sacred. That's not a brand or strategy in order to serve as a stepping stone for the next career move. You see what I mean?
Yeah.
And so we've got spiritual problems and spiritual challenges here we have to be very honest about. And we just don't have enough folk with integrity, honesty, and decency who want to tell the truth, no matter what the consequences are.
Yeah. And we've got to bridge the disconnect that often exists from scholars who claim to be interpreting movements, but not necessarily connected to those movements, right? I mean, you've been arrested, you've been protested, you've been willing to put your life on the line. And so that's a problem as well, right? How do we fuse or bridge the gap rather that currently exists, would you say?
No, I think that's true. And a lot of that just has to do with the fact that, you know, when you have a deep love, you see, it's not just about justice. Any justice that's only justice soon degenerates into something less than justice. And you can end up selling your soul for a mess of pottage. Love is deeper than justice. Concern, care for people, the connection to people. You know, it's like your relation to your mama. It's not in relation to justice. Well, that ought to be the model for relation to people. It's not just justice. Justice is a crucial part of it. But when you loving folk, when you sacrificing for folk, and everybody does it imperfectly, there's no doubt about that, you see. But that's what overcomes the gap.
Yeah.
You see what I mean? So that you don't even think about it. I mean, I've been blessed teaching prison for 41 years. I don't think about that as part of a justice cause. I love the brothers. We have a good time.
Yeah.
We go from Plato to Billie Holiday. We wrestling with life, death, sadness, sorrow, and making sure that their humanity, their beauty, and most importantly, their potential to be love warriors and freedom fighters is accented.
Yeah. Yeah, no, well said. I'm thinking the past 4 years under the Trump administration has obviously been devastating for Americans in general, and I would say Black Americans in particular. What are the key issues that you're hoping that the Biden and Harris administration can focus on? And again, I use that word hope. I know you prefer that over optimism.
That's true.
And I'm wondering if you see any room for improvement as we move into these upcoming years.
Again, I mean, we're living in a decadent empire, so it's not just a domestic question. You got militarism abroad in the Middle East. You got AFRICOM in Africa. You got the dictatorial rule in Haiti and other places. So that there's got to be a connection between the police crimes and police brutality, and we're seeing that manifest, of course, both in Minneapolis and across the nation. Then you've got Wall Street crimes and Wall Street brutality and criminality, but it's much more subtle. All that wealth is hemorrhaged at the top, and you got all this poverty and working people living right on the edge, kind of thing Brother William Barber talks about with great insight. And then you've got, in addition to you got Pentagon. So you got police, Wall Street, Pentagon crimes. Drones dropped on innocent people. And that's true no matter whether the president's Democrat or Republican. So we can't just focus on the domestic and not connect the international. And Brother Martin said the bombs dropped in Vietnam landed in Harlem because of the military budget. 53% of every dollar. You see what I mean? So we have to be able to make those kind of connections, but it's also true we had to get the neo-fascist gangster out. Trump had to go, and that was Black people, especially Black women. 18% of Black brothers voted for Trump. 58% of white brothers voted for Trump. 53% of white sisters. How they gonna vote for a fascist? They did. 1 out of 3 Latinos, 1 out of 3 Jews, 28% of queers voted for Trump. So it was Black people again that had to come to the rescue to save the nation from going off a neo-fascist cliff. We did it in 200. We did it with 200,000 Black soldiers in the 1860s. We did it in the 1960s with Fannie Lou and Ella Baker and Stokely Carmichael and Martin King and the others. You see, but then the question becomes: will our Black poor and Black working class brothers and sisters get re-crucified as our Black middle class still gains access to new opportunities? You see, we've seen this in terms of the flow of the monies, corporate money. They giving money to certain folk. Is it trickling down to Brother Jamal and Sister Letitia in the hood? That's always a challenge. And as Christians, and this is what me and Brother Sharpton agree fundamental, it's Matthew 25. It's the least of these. That's the measure. It's the poor, it's the prisoner, it's the orphan, it's the widow, it's the fatherless, it's the motherless, you see. And part of Brother Sharpton's genius, even given my critique of my brother, is that he has a unbelievable intellect and an unbelievable heart of commitment to be persistent. And that's what 30 years of Nan is all about. And I do applaud him for that, even given our various disagreements, under the Obama administration and so on.
No, well said. And finally, Dr. West, you're heading back to Union Theological Seminary after Harvard refused to grant you tenure, although you had already been tenured there in Yale and Princeton and a number of other institutions. And one of the things that I noticed during the coverage of that story was the number of younger Black and brown scholars who commented on social media, if Dr. Cornel West is not tenured by Harvard, even though he's written all of these books and is prolific and has done the work, what are my chances for being able to gain tenure within the academy? So I wonder, what advice would you give to these young Black scholars who are working day in and day out to amplify the voices of Black and Brown and Indigenous people within the academy? Do you have any advice for them where they may feel frustrated?
Well, you just want to be true to yourself, but you want to find your voice. Lift every voice. That's our anthem. No echoes here, no extensions of echo chambers. And two, you want to preserve to the best of your ability your integrity, honesty, and decency, and solidarity with poor and working people. And so whatever identity we have has got to be rooted in integrity and solidarity. And then you see what the consequences are. So I come from a Christian tradition. Seek ye first the kingdom. Everything else that you don't need, you're going to get. But that's that important thing. But it's also true, I think, that my own association with my precious Palestinian brothers and sisters, given the vicious Israeli occupation, was one crucial factor. And we don't have a whole lot of Black voices who highlight that issue. And we have to raise it in such a way that we're not in any way anti-Jewish, that we recognize our Jewish brothers and sisters are precious. They are as precious as anybody else, but a Palestinian baby has exactly the same value as an Israeli Jewish baby. And therefore, that particular issue does push me a bit more to the margins. And so one has to be mindful of what consequences are when you raise certain kind of taboo issues in any context. And that's fine. You know, you pay that cost and you keep moving. You know what I mean? Yeah. Very much so. But the crucial thing is that, you know, in the end, well, we Black folk, we are great people. We are world historical people. We keep dishing out love warriors in the face of hate and freedom fighters in the face of terror, and wounded healers and scar providers in the face of trauma. And 30 years of NAN, building on the Black freedom movement, this particular phase and this particular stage in the Black freedom movement. And old brother Sharpton, still going with all of his smile and style and all of his love on the inside and all on his unbelievable ability to persist on the other. So I send my love. And of course, when you love somebody, you protect him. I protect my brother Al Sharpton. That's why I was there when he got out of jail and gave him a hug. He was looking like all that beautiful beard he had. It was something else. Gave him a hug. And you respect him. I have a great, not just respect, but love for my dear brother, but also correct. He corrects me. Yeah. I say, I love it. I correct him. Just like jazz musicians, we bouncing off against each other to the best of our ability. And we got to tell our young folk, that's what the young folk is all about. Yeah. When your love folk is not always agreement, but it's the love of the people that's bigger. And that's something that unites Brother Sharpton and myself and yourself and all of the panelists, all of those folk at this historic convention. Yeah. And especially my dear brother Dwight. Yeah. Nobody like it.
All right, thank you, Dr. Cornel West. We now have an outstanding panel to delve into this discussion, so please allow me to introduce Dr. Amani Perry, who is the Hughes Rogers Professor of African American Studies at Princeton University and a faculty associate with the programs in Law and Public Affairs, Gender and Sexuality Studies, and Jazz Studies. She is the author of numerous books, including my favorite, Looking for Lorraine, The Radiant and Radical Life of Lorraine Hansberry. Dr. Peniel Joseph is a professor of public affairs and the Barbara Jordan Chair in Ethics and Political Values at the University of Texas at Austin. He is also the founding director of the Center for the Study of Race and Democracy. He's the author, again, of numerous books, including The Sword and the Shield, The Revolutionary Lives of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. We have Dr. Keisha Blaine, who is an associate professor of history at the University of Pittsburgh, is a fellow at the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy at Harvard University. She is the author of Set the World on Fire, Black Nationalist Women in the Global Struggle for Freedom, and co-editor of several books, including, I have it right here, 400 Souls, which I'm reading now, that she edited alongside Dr. Ibram X. Kendi, our final panelist, who is the Andrew W. Mellon Professor in the Humanities at Boston University and the founding director of the BU Center for Anti-Racist Research. He's the author of many books, including How to Be an Anti-Racist. So welcome. Glad you all are here. So I just want to start off really with really a basic question, and that is, what is the role of the Black intellectual, as you all see it, in interpreting and amplifying the voices of the freedom struggle? So who wants to start off? Dr. Joseph?
Okay, I'll say one of my mentors, I'll say two of my mentors, Sonia Sanchez and Manning Marable, and they always told me that the role of the Black intellectual was scholarship in the service of activism and transformation. So from their perspectives, Sonia Sanchez, who's a poet and one of the architects of the Black arts movement, and then Manning Marable, the late Manning Marable, who's a Columbia University professor and radical political activist and intellectual. The role of Black intellectuals was to absolutely do scholarship, go to the archives, learn the story and sort of get the story straight, but not stay ensconced in some kind of ebony or ivory tower, to connect that scholarship to the actual real world lives and suffering of Black people. So you could have somebody like Sonia Sanchez, who didn't have a BA, didn't have, a PhD, but is a genius, become a professor at Temple University. And you had somebody like Manning Marable, small town Black boy from Indiana, who became one of the most important intellectuals of the 20th century. And they both said scholarship in the service of activism. And I think historically, when you think about Ida B. Wells or Lorraine Hansberry or Jimmy Baldwin, so many different folks, that's what we've done at our best, at our best. Yes.
Yeah. Well said. Dr. Perry.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I think, as with everything else in academia, it is true that all skin folk ain't kid folk. So there are intellectuals who are Black, which is a different category than I think the Black intellectual. I think part of our responsibility is to take seriously the knowledges that come out of our community. So academic training tends to be very formulaic and conventional, but we have stores of knowledge that exist in our elders, that exist through our experiences, that exist through our critical perspectives, and to value that. I mean, I think this is exactly, consistent with Peniel's point, in particular about Sonia Sanchez. So I'll just give an example. So she's originally from Birmingham, Alabama, like I am. And as I was writing about the history of the Black National Anthem, I went to personal stories she told about what it was like to hear the anthem playing publicly in Birmingham as a small child, right? And she had this, and she talked about the pageantries. It's not sort of conventional to go to those type of sort of personal remembrances that are off the cuff, but I knew I had to go to people who were there at a time and place to capture the significance of the song emotionally, right? And I knew I had to go to Black schools, which is not necessarily where people start. People tend to start with authors, right, as opposed to experiences and community and that. So for me, it is to take seriously what we know and to put that into the formal world of ideas, so that our traditions, our people, our stories are not just valued, but remembered, like long past our lifetimes.
Yeah. Dr. Kendi?
Yeah, and I think to continuously sort of echo what Dr. Joseph and Dr. Perry is stating, I think the first day that I realized that I may be on a journey to being a Black intellectual was when I walked into a barbershop. I think it was in New Brunswick when I was doing a postdoc there, a Black barbershop. And, it was my first time there. So of course the barber were like, "Who are you?" And I told him that I was, a professor and on fellowship at Rutgers. And so him and another barber started telling me about an argument that they were having about Black folks or about racism. I forget what the argument was. And basically I became the referee. And in many ways, I guess what I'm speaking to, continuing with with what Dr. Perry stated, really I took very seriously, the different sides of the debates, really wanted to show how in many ways they were both right, and even add some historical or cultural or sort of data context to what they were stating. And so for me, I see the role of the Black intellectual of clarifying what Black folks are experiencing and going through on a daily basis, almost giving them the glasses to see their world and to see themselves a little more clearer, than they already see it.
Well said, Dr. Blaine.
Well, I agree with everything that has already been said, and I would just emphasize, for me, of course, I approach this through the lens, of a historian, and it's always about providing the historical context that would be useful for contemporary movements, certainly to provide the tools that will be useful for activists. And so I write intentionally. The kinds of books that I write, the kinds of articles that I write, are meant to be useful in a way that extends far beyond just contributing to the academy. Of course, we have so many demands as professors, and we have to produce and we have to please our colleagues in many ways. But I think what's core to being a public intellectual certainly is recognizing that you are not only teaching and researching and writing for academics, for folks in your field, but you are writing and engaging a broader public. And so I completely agree with everything that has already been said. And I'm just, I think, grateful to be a part of this community at a moment where there's so many challenges that we're facing. And it's, I think, so important for all of us to utilize our skills and our talents to be in the service of our communities.
No, I think that's a really important point, and that gets to the whole question of making scholarship accessible, right, to the masses, and not everyone can do that in the academy. And I've often heard individuals like Michael Eric Dyson and others talk about having the platform of being on TV, where really the nation is indeed your students, and you can kind of help them understand some of these issues, but you got to have the right language and the context in order to be able to do that. And Ibram, I think about your background and work, particularly trained as a journalist, but you're also a historian as well. And so I was wondering how much of that journalism training that you had early on has benefited and helped you as a historian writing about these kinds of issues.
Oh, I mean, it was absolutely a game changer, for me, because in many ways, as a student, I was taught systematically how to write for everyday people, and also how to provide sort of clarity to complex issues for everyday people, how to bring voices of everyday people into the stories, how to see everyday people as the audience as opposed to other academics, and so I think it was critical for me because I did not get that training in graduate school, so we're not necessarily taught systematically how to write an op-ed in the New York Times or how to write a book for a trade press. We're only necessarily taught how to write, let's say, a journal article or a university press book. And many university press books are great books, and many of them are accessible. But sometimes when even people want to publish in university presses for the general public, there's pushback from the press itself, or there's pushback from reviewers, and so there's so many pressures to prevent us from reaching Black people with our work and expertise. And so I was lucky that I sort of started out in journalism.
Yeah, I think that I get this from my mother. I always praise my mother, as Black folks do, and as a Black Christian Baptist, New Bethel Baptist Church, by way of a New York City storefront. And my parents are Haitian immigrants, and my mom loved not just going to church, but we used to go to Harlem and go to other parts of Brooklyn and listen to street speakers as well, right? And so one of the reasons why I'm so interested in Malcolm X and some folks like that is their adage was to make it plain, right? The idea that whatever you were explaining to, especially Black people, I always think of Black people as my audience. I think of my mother as my audience. You could make it plain, even if it was theoretical. I remember talking to Black folks in Brooklyn and 125th Street. The first time I heard about Antonio Gramsci was in Harlem. And these are folks these are Black women and men who were telling you, and sort of, yes, they were talking about Marcus Garvey and Ida B. Wells, but they were even talking about sort of this kind of high theory that we usually think of as something you only get inside of a very prestigious classroom. So this idea of making it plain, I think I'm always grateful to have grown up in New York City, grown up in parts of Queens that Ibram has grown up in, and parts of Brooklyn, but also Harlem. We had people in Harlem, so that's been a big part of my life. So making it plain, I always think about what Malcolm X said, and not teaching or talking or speaking in basically ways that obscure what we're trying to get across.
Yeah, so I feel a couple of different ways about this question. I think as someone who identifies strongly as a writer, who thinks the beauty of a sentence is important, I want to connect with a wide body of readers. But I also think amongst scholars, there is a place for specialized knowledge, and that is not going to be easily accessible. So for example, I read medical journals related to my illnesses. They are not easy for me to read. They are a challenge, right, to access. I want to know the information. We have, as Black folks, a tradition of stretching ourselves in relationship to acquiring knowledge, right? So Frederick Douglass talking about the struggle to become literate, right? Malcolm talking about that struggle. Septima Clark modeling it as an educator, that there is a virtue in stretching to see literacy and acquiring information as a labor of love. And reading is a muscle, right? It's something that is cultivated. The more you do it, the better you get at it, the more sophisticated you are as a reader. So on the one hand, I do think it is absolutely wonderful that we actually have a growing body of scholars who move outside of the academy. I think it's meaningful work. I think all of that is magnificent, but I also don't think it is helpful for us to denigrate people who have specialized knowledge, because we need that. There are lots of things that shaped the way that I write and the way that I think, accessible to a larger public, but the original article I read, nobody is going to read that besides the person who has specialized knowledge. That's an important work. And so for me, the question is more, what is your relationship to Black communities? Are you accountable? Do you have a deep relationship, as opposed to, for me, that's the most critical thing. That's more important than how you talk in public or how you write in public, is the values that undergird the work.
No, absolutely. I think that's really important. And again, the connection, as you point out, to the Black community, I think becomes critical. And I want to ask a question about whether or not you all view yourselves as activists. I mean, I certainly do in following the work that you all do, but I was wondering, how do you all self-identify, and how do these dueling identities, or maybe they're not dueling at all, intersect in terms of your scholarly work and then your activist side, if you deem yourself as an activist? Keisha, you want to start?
Sure. I certainly think of myself as both activist and scholar, and I actually don't see both categories as being in opposition at all. And of course, we earlier in this conversation evoked W.E.B. Du Bois, but also I think about Ida B. Wells, and just so many examples of individuals who certainly produce scholarship in a wide way, but also they were producing scholarship that was intentional in the service of activism. And so Ida B. Wells, clearly as someone collecting data and writing about lynching, we can certainly frame her as a scholar in that lens. But of course, what was she doing? Well, she was an activist, and she was an anti-lynching crusader, and W. Du Bois, and so many other examples we can emphasize. And those are models for me. And that's certainly the way that I approach my own writing and everything that I do. As I said earlier, for me, it's about being intentional. I absolutely agree, with Professor Perry's point earlier. Everyone will not produce the same kind of work, and we all have to play our own role. And for me, it's about producing scholarship that I want people to be able to utilize in the service of activism. That I think is key.
Part of what we're all trying to do, and I definitely think of myself as both. And I think I was an activist before becoming a scholar, and I think of myself as a lifelong student. I think part of what we're trying to do is we're on our own journey. I think all of us, especially here on this panel, are folks who love to think and to engage and to have intellectual curiosity. So from that perspective, I know my writing has changed, and you hope that your writing changes and grows over time, and your interests change and grow over time. I think on some levels, it's all of a piece. I think I look at people's works, and I remember somebody telling me 30 years ago that when I started graduate school, that we were basically all trying to write the same book over and over again. But what they meant by that was this. They didn't mean you were trying to replicate yourself, but it meant each time there's kind of this core truth, this aspirational mountaintop you're trying to reach, and you never quite get there. You never quite get there. But each new project or iteration brings you hopefully incrementally one step closer, right? And so that becomes, I think about somebody like these are people who probably did reach the mountaintop, Toni Morrison and other people. But when you read their whole works, you really see the growth, the development, but you also see the difference. The person who wrote Beloved versus Sula or Song of Solomon, right? It's extraordinary. And so I think of myself as somebody who's on a journey, and I'm happy that I think we're at a real epic moment in terms of both historically, but also in terms of the scholarship that's being produced, the work, the novels, the essays that are being produced. So, and I think it's extraordinary. I remember reading something that Professor Perry wrote in the New York Times about the moon launch, right? And just even the angle, and I've read Doug Brinkley's Moonshot, right? But then it's from a Black woman, Black feminist, really extraordinarily brilliant perspective that gives you so much, right? And I've learned so much. I've taught Professor Blaine, taught Professor Kendi and Perry. I've learned so much. And like these four scholars here are not only just historians, they're cultural critics, they're policy experts. It's so interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary that it's just an exciting time. We talk about the Harlem Renaissance and the Chicago Renaissance. 50 years from now, people are going to talk about this moment, including people here. And you've already talked to Dr. West, who really were helping to shape how we think panoramically about the Black experience. And I think that's truly striking and extraordinary, and just grateful. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I want to bring in Ibram. I want to bring you in, but it's also amazing as I'm listening to you talk about how you all collaborate as scholars together, which I think is really nice, because we often think of the academy as being this cutthroat kind of competitive place. And it's nice to see relatively young Black scholars who are kind of bouncing ideas off one another, co-editing books together without that kind of cutthroat or competitive kind of, angle, which I don't think is always helpful. So that's just, I don't know if any of you, or how did that all happen? Because it's not necessarily something we hear a lot about, and certainly not reported or covered very well. So Ibram, let me get you in.
So, well, I think in many ways the academy is that cutthroat place, and I know Black scholars, particularly those who have those values that Professor Perry talked about earlier, are able to see those shared values in each other and are able to sort of figure out ways to work together, and almost their intellectual connections and our intellectual connections almost become safe spaces from this larger sort of cutthroat battle. And so at least that's certainly what it is, for me. And also I'll add, I think coming out of a Black studies tradition where in many ways we're implored to straddle scholarship and activism. I have also come to just really admire and cherish both scholars and activists. And I think in both areas, you know, the Black scholar and even the Black activist are these huge sort of skyscrapers to me. And so trying to imagine the sort of bridging both has probably, for me, it's almost, I feel like for me, it's almost too much. I'm just trying to be a good scholar. And I know how hard it is, especially with the tradition of scholars that are writing and thinking right now and in this historical tradition. But I think it just goes to show for me just how much I admire scholars and just how much I admire activists. And so I just try to, like I said, be a great scholar.
I think I want to in part echo what Ibram said. And say it also this way. I don't identify as an organizer, but it is not, but I identify myself as someone who has the responsibility to join my labors to organizing efforts. Mm-hmm. But for me, and I grew up, my world, I was surrounded by organizers, and it is not an easy life. It is a life that is often very vulnerable, very fraught. You know, I grew up with people calling from prison who were political prisoners weekly, phone tapped. I mean, there's a kind of relationship to the world that is really one in which oftentimes you're under attack, right? Constantly. And so I feel like I can't claim, I know there's a wide range of activists and organizers, but I feel like I would have a lot of hubris to claim that in my relatively comfortable life. But it is the case that we have a responsibility. And like Ibram said, to the sort of skyscraper, right? Like of this tradition demands something of us, right? Whether it is joining in at important moments, whether it is taking to the street when it's time to be present with folks, whether it is lifting up people who were scholar activists who were diminished because of the activist part of being a scholar, right? That, I mean, so I have a student who's doing extraordinary work now on June Jordan, and she's the perfect example, like this incredible intellectual who had this sort of marginal relationship in some ways, even though she taught at all these top flight universities because of the ways in which what she did was not fully valued, right? And so, so I guess that's how I think of it. But I also think the scholar activist is an important role. It is an emerging role in sort of new ways because they're scholar activists, like we have here, who are able to navigate both institutional success and being connected to the public in important ways and organizing important ways. So I don't mean, so when I say I don't necessarily identify, I don't mean that critically. I just mean that's, my space.
Yeah, but it also seems to me that given the prominence of the work that you all do, that people often look to you to respond or comment whenever something happens. And that's true. And I wonder if that's a lot of pressure. Obviously, many of you are thinking about these issues constantly, so it's probably always in your brain. But I'm just wondering, how does that play into the work that you do, where, again, people are often looking to you on social media to offer some kind of commentary to whatever happens. So Keisha, did you want to comment on that?
Sure. And I think everyone responds and engages this differently. For me, I simply don't comment on everything. And I also don't comment immediately on everything. There are simply moments where I need to process. I need to even work through my own emotions, because that's one of the lessons I learned the hard way, especially with social media. Sometimes something happens and you tweet something and you feel it and you mean what you say, but because you didn't carefully sit with it for a little bit, it comes off the wrong way, people interpret it the wrong way, and then it actually leads to greater harm than any good. So part of what I have learned to do is figure out when are the moments that I need to speak up, and what, what medium to use to speak up. I'm currently going to release my own statement, so to speak, on several recent developments, and I'll do that in print. I'll do that in the form of an op-ed, because I need 1,200 words to flesh out what it is I want to say. 240 characters won't really do it for me. So I just think each person has to figure out their own process, and I've tried to be careful not to allow the expectations of others to drive my actions. Yes, so people are always, what do you think? What do you think? Well, I'll tell you what I think, but let me make sure that I've thought carefully about it, and that I'm ready to speak on it, because I think timing matters as much as the statement, and the delivery matters as much as the statement as well.
I think that is right. I think, depending on how large people's, I guess, social media platforms are, or even their local connections and networks. I live in Austin, Texas now, and there's a Black community here, tiny relative to where I've lived before, but about 8%, who absolutely look towards some of the work that I do when things happen here and happen nationally, which just happened to Dante Wright, in Brooklyn Central, Minnesota. So these tragedies, these killings, these, especially the murders of so many Black women and men by the police, and at times by vigilantes, really calls people are looking for hope, So I think there is that, I would say, Jamal, it's more of a responsibility than a burden. But I do agree that, I'm Generation X, so I don't necessarily lash out on social media anyway. So I was raised in a different way, you know what I mean? So I'm just, so that's one thing. But I do think people are looking for hope. And I think the price that we pay, and I've been to churches and different communities outside of the academy, is that people want you to clarify what's going on, but also give them hope. Right? To also give them hope. So, and then it becomes, you want to do that, or at least I want to do it, but in an authentic way, right? So I want to get to hope through the clarity, and authentically at times, if I'm despairing or if I'm feeling grief or trauma, convey that to people too, that, hey, this is what I'm feeling. I'm at bottom, an optimist or hopeful, but I want us to confront the depth of the challenge that we're facing. And we're facing big challenges. And I think for this generation of Black intellectuals, it's a little different than it has been in the past, because there's more of us who are getting platforms. I remember when the people who had platforms were sort of bell hooks and Darlene Clark Hine, obviously Dr. West, Skip Gates, and now, it's one, we have an extraordinary large number of Black women having a platform, as they always should have, but right now they really do, even to the point where they're getting a lot of extra criticism because of the platform, right? But at least they have the platform, which is good. But these platforms are competitive, and we still do live in a neoliberal, democratic, capitalist society. And really with an emphasis on neoliberal and capitalist, and a smaller emphasis on democracy. So there is, there's a lot of complexity to this moment. I think everybody here realizes that complexity.
And I think for me, I try to, especially as a scholar, as Professor Blaine spoke about, to take some time, because then that allows you to think, which then allows you to say something that can cause other people to think. And so I do think it is, even as we're providing, hope, as Professor Joseph stated, how can we provide hope? And I think this is, echoing what Professor Joseph stated, while simultaneously giving that clarity. And in order to give that clarity, we have to sort of think about it. But then we you know, and so that's what I'm sort of trying to think about. And sometimes, as has already been stated, I feel like on this panel, like I'm just like, yep. Because there's such a large number of people have already said what you're thinking, right? So there's really nothing that you need to say other than retweet or share or elevate, you know, what other people are saying, which to me is also great, right? Because you don't feel alone. And then you also know that, and I try to lean in my own specific expertise, and other Black scholars have different, we all have different areas of expertise. And I think leaning in our own expertise gives space to other people to lean into theirs. So that's also important for me.
How do you see it, Professor Perry?
Okay, well, I'll say I'm going to undo a little bit about what I said before, because I have, you know, the hothead child who was, you know, somebody gave the bullhorn to when I was 5 years old. I still have that in me. So I'm going to say, oftentimes without the kind of measured analysis that I ought to have, but I will speak, and I will, and sometimes I have to sort of take things back or re-engage them or say, you know what, I said that too quickly. But so I have a lot of appreciation for the process of being more deliberate and not having a hothead response. I think that's something that is generally, like, I'm Generation X too, but I have 2 Generation Z children who are often the people who are like, yeah, mom, shh, that's enough, right? So that tell you a little. But I also, here's the piece that I find really challenging about this dynamic, right? Is, so part of what I think, there's 2 poles, right? So there's one, and even maybe more, right? So people, I think Black folks often want you to say things that speak to what's on Black folks' mind, right? Mm-hmm. To represent, right? And there's a tension between being a representative of a collective set of beliefs and being a scholar, because being a scholar and intellectual often puts you in tension with broad beliefs, because we are trained to be critical, right? To raise questions, to challenge. So that is one tension. And then to add, you know, to what, you know, to echo what Peniel said, the neoliberal marketplace model, right, makes us often want to say things that people want to hear, because that's what you get praised for, right? Yeah. And so I'm always thinking about this formulation, and I'm pretty sure it came from Dr. West, right? I'm almost certain, you know, where he says, we do this work because we love the people, not so the people will love us. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Right? Which means that you have to have the courage of being at times unpopular, attacked, right? And people will talk to you like you're like 7 years old on social media. And you're like, wait a minute, like, I studied some things, right? Like, stop talking to me crazy. And so, but I do think that that's, and I do think that there's a piece, even when there's a backlash, people can feel over time when you love the people, right? Mm-hmm. There's something that, you know, after people are done attacking you, you are still cherished in some ways over the long haul. And so I just feel like we have to, like, that's something you have to constantly tell yourself about this specific area, right?
No, that's important. Yeah, thank you for that. Peniel, you started off really talking about your mentors, Sonia Sanchez, Manny Marable. Amani, I know in my conversation with Cornel West, he talked about how you were one of his mentees. And I was just wondering, are you all encouraged by what you see in terms of graduate students and others who are coming up the ranks? You talked about some of your students, Amani, that you're working with, who's doing some really good work. I was wondering, are you all encouraged by what you see out there in the future of the field? And are you encouraged by it, Keisha?
I'm very encouraged by it, especially because I think over the last couple of years, It has been great to have so many students, particularly at the graduate level, who reach out to me, who are interested in writing dissertations on topics that are certainly aligned with mine. But I'm struck by how so many of them say, I specifically want to work with you because I'm committed to producing scholarship that has a broader reach beyond the four walls of academia. I love that because it shows how much I think things are changing. And so many graduate students, of course, and I should also mention being mindful of the realities of the job market too, are thinking about ways that they can use their PhDs far beyond simply becoming a professor. So they have to think critically and also think creatively. But more to the point, they are trying to figure out how to write, how to do research for a larger community beyond just academia, and so many of them are reaching out to me and asking for advice and wanting to learn from me and certainly from others, how to write op-eds, how to speak in a way that's clear, so that you're able to reach as many people as possible, and your ideas are able to transform, I think, and be tools for the larger goals that we've been talking about today. So I'm certainly encouraged by that and look forward to more and more graduate students and also undergraduate students thinking critically about how the research they're doing can also be translated to a larger public.
Oh yeah, no, I mean, I feel old here because I remember I look at Dr. Kendi as one of my mentees who became the biggest thing going. I remember 15 years ago when he contacted me about. I might have been at Brandeis at the time, and he was at Temple. And I think one of the things mentoring people teaches you, and look at Cornell West mentored Imani Perry and like sort of italicized. It teaches you that, look, some of the same students that you're trying to help are going to become not just the next generation, but big, iconic, intellectuals and thinkers. So you have to have humility too. As a mentor, you don't know everything, and you're going to have people who come see aspects of what you're doing with your writing, your thinking, and be very generative with that. And I think that's how it should be. So I think this newer generation has been really extraordinary, and I'm really grateful for. In my case, I thought about Black Power in at the time different ways, at least decades ago, and so many different people have just expanded that in such rich ways that it's really truly extraordinary, especially from a discipline that was not a subfield that people were saying we were crazy. Those of us who were trying to plant the flag for Black Power, not just as a more than a movement, as something that was really paradigmatic. If we talked about feminism, the left, the Cold War, just epistemology, and now we're seeing it, right? And so I think it's been extraordinary to see. But again, to see people like Professor Kendi and Professor Blaine just building fields, intellectual fields and subfields has been really extraordinary. And like I said, I mean, at bottom, I think those of us who do this and you retain your passion, you're a student. So I try to read, everything. It's hard, right? Especially when you're reading for book projects. But I read their work continuously, right? And I've learned a lot from their work because it's like Professor Kendi was saying, all of us have a very specific expertise. And so when you try to dive into, I couldn't have written, Looking for Lorraine. I couldn't have written Set the World on Fire or How to Be an Anti-Racist or Stamped from the Beginning, the way in which these scholars have written it. And the great thing is you learn so much. And I think Manning Marable taught me, and Sonia did too, is that, the more you learned, the more you were adding their great brilliance to your own quiver, right? And so some people say, well, how are you sounding so smart about Black nationalist women and all this stuff? Like, well, I just finished reading Keisha Blake. You know everything about Lorraine Hansberry and all this critical stuff. It's like, well, I read Imani and the Anthem book. And then Ibram is taking us way, way back to, when you think about Stamp from the beginning, and I remember reading that as a manuscript, what a tour de force, you know what I mean? What a tour de force from the 15th century to the present. And they say, well, damn, about all these folks, Cotton Mather and all that. And I was like, well, I read Ibram's stuff. And now 400 Souls does that in a really great way too. So that's what's so exciting about this.
And the graciousness is that you actually cite the scholars as well, which we know.
I cite everybody. I think that
which is another issue, I think, right? In where again, we often don't give credit to where the credit should rightfully be. Ibram, are you encouraged by what you're seeing out in the field working with students?
So I am, and I think I can certainly, remember when, at the time when I entered graduate school, those scholars who were trying to lift up Black Power studies like you were, and even scholars who are writing on the Black radical tradition more broadly, even Black feminist scholars. I mean, one of the things that I think I see now, and especially when I compare this to when I entered graduate school, I've written about the ways in which, my gender politics and the politics of how I understood sexuality was extremely retrograde, and it was extremely bigoted. And what I'm seeing now is students entering graduate school with a much more sophisticated intersectional analysis, with a much more sophisticated analysis of capitalism. And in many ways, I had to learn about all of that, in graduate school. And so I'm finding now okay, y'all got that a baseline for the most part, which then allows us to have a deeper and richer and more expansive and more specific, conversations, which then allows them, when they ultimately leave graduate school, to be at a level that it took me years after graduate school, to reach. And I'm excited about that. I really am. And I'm excited specifically about just how expansive the Black radical sort of tradition is. It's almost like, I don't want to say a constant, but there's just a community of scholars who take it, for granted, as we should, right? That type of radical thought. And that then allows younger scholars to have the confidence that they could think in that way and write in that way, because they see so many people doing that all around them. Now, we don't probably tell them as much about the ways in which we're still getting attacked viciously and constantly because of that. But even still, I think it's important to instill in them that confidence.
Yeah. I was just thinking, this is the last question, and then and we'll have to wrap it up. These are turbulent times, all right, and they're scary times, and they're dangerous times in many ways, particularly when we think about the racial violence that's being, that Black folks are being subjected to, and other groups as well. And I was wondering, how do you deal with all of that in real time as scholars and process it, really, because it seems to me that it can be very taxing and overwhelming. and how do you protect your own kind of mental health and at the same time want to contribute to the discussion and dialogue? And there are only a certain number of hours in the day, and I know that you all work all the time. So how do you think about this kind of stuff? Given where we are in our world. Keisha?
It's very difficult. Someone reached out to me yesterday and asked if I want to try a piece about the Chauvin trial. And I said, no, I actually have not been watching the trial. And I think they were surprised, like, how in the world could you not be watching the trial? Well, for my peace of mind, I'm certainly following. And of course, it's impossible not to be aware of what is happening in the trial. If you're watching local news, if you're watching national news, you are going to know. At the same time, I simply could not put myself through that trauma again, quite frankly, because like so many of us, I had gone through it last year already and struggled last summer watching the video of George Floyd. That was just too much to bear then. And it's quite frankly too much for me to bear now. And I just decided, in this moment, I can contribute in various ways. I can lend my voice as a writer, as a thinker, in all kinds of areas, but I'm not going to write about the trial because I'm not going to watch the trial. And that's just my decision. So I think, I referenced this earlier. I think you have to know your boundaries. You have to set your own boundaries. You have to decide for yourself what it is you're going to be engaged in and how you'll be engaged. And for me, I think part of being a public intellectual is recognizing, that I too get discouraged. Yes, I do believe I am a hopeful person, and I always try to convey a spirit of hope, but I also get discouraged. And there are days when I have to convince myself to continue in the work because everything just seems so bleak. And at those moments, I need time to process. I need time to remind myself. I need time, to speak to others. And sometimes my cup, gets empty, and I need others to fill that cup so I can then pour out again the next day. So I just think we have to be aware of, truly. I mean, we're talking about activism and scholarship, but let's also talk about mental health. Let's also talk about emotional health. Let's also talk about self-care, because that, I think, is also part of the narrative, because I want to be able to continue the work, for 20, 30, 40, 50 years. And to do that, I have to take care of myself at every level. And I think part of it is being intentional about what I engage, what I don't engage, and how I engage things. All of that is key.
Anyone else want to quickly chime in here?
Say really quickly, because the way you asked the question struck me, because it occurred to me that my response is much more frequently as a mother than as a scholar. And so I think about, and that actually is what allows me to try to do some work in relationship, because I think, what is my response? I've brought these people into the world. What is my responsibility to leave it in a condition that is not as horrific as what we have now, right? But that also, I think consistent with what Keisha said, is that work takes on multiple forms. Like, I think part of the reason, as historians, part of the reason, it reminds me of this question that Jamaica Kincaid has Lucy ask in her novel. Lucy's a domestic worker from the Caribbean in the United States, and she looks at her white employer and she keeps being like, how did you get to be like that, right? I feel like that's part of, how did we get to be, this society get to be like this? And so sometimes the immediacy is too much. I don't like watching people be killed, right? But I do think part of our calling is to figure out, how did this come to pass so that we can undo it, right? And that seems to me to be the thing I'm always responsible for, which may not be like responding every instance, but like the life work, which is much more than the specific instance.
Yeah. No, well said. A couple more minutes. Anyone else want to chime in?
So I think for me, I think it's a difficult sort of time for me, because the right is just constantly seeking to attack and discredit and undermine, and so having to deal with that, and seeing other activists and other scholars facing similar, and journalists, facing similar, deliberate attacks, and then, waking up one morning and seeing that yet again someone else was murdered by the police, and then looking at data from COVID-19 and seeing Black folks are still dying, at the highest rates. I think for me, it causes me to have to sort of retreat, and even retreat into writing. And so, to try to feel as if I'm still contributing to the larger struggle, but at the same time not becoming overwhelmed and even traumatized. So it's it's something I'm still sort of learning how to sort of deal with. And partly because, as Peniel talked about, I'm from Jamaica, Queens, like I can't not respond. And so trying to not because especially with folks on social media say things to you that, they would not say to you, in public, right? Or as Imani talked about, even folks who demonstrate that they don't know what they're talking about when they tell you you don't know what you're talking about. Like to just not respond is tough. But at the same time, if you do respond, you're going to go down a rabbit hole, and then at the end of it, you're going to feel even worse than you do now. So I think it's something I suspect we're all still trying to work out, on a regular basis.
Well said. Peniel, I'll give you the last word.
Yeah, what I've done is really what everybody's talked about here, but what this time has made me do. I'm writing a short book, 50,000 words on this period as America's third Reconstruction, and I've really gone back and deep into Du Bois and deep into Ida B. Wells and just deep into the first Reconstruction, right? And sort of this metaphor of this past, say 15 years as sort of a third Reconstruction, civil rights movement as a second Reconstruction. How do we get out of this? What has changed? Certain things actually have changed, what has been positive about seeing some of what we've talked about, sort of the intersectional analysis and leadership of Black women. What has remained the same, sort of the changing same. Du Bois has a great line in Black Reconstruction where he talks about America as a land where they worshiped God wildly, where they bought and sold human beings every day, and that still into the 20th century, they were burning men alive, right? Men, human beings alive, right? And so, I think this time period has definitely cast into sharp relief how close we all live to that period, right? That, because I think part of the narrative that we were fed, which is not true, was that sort of the civil rights movement had won, and that victory had really made our lives much better than our ancestors, much better. And I think that what we have seen, even those of us who've got relative privilege that and relative comfort, like Professor Perry was saying, we are so close to Sojourner Truth, and we are so close to what Du Bois called the slave power of the United States. Never ended. It never ended. But we were told it did. So it's just like the whole thing, the biggest trick the devil ever did on everybody to say, hey, the devil doesn't exist, right? It's just a rumor, right? So we were told the slave power was ended. And I think that what we've seen, and for Black folks, they knew it was Sandra Bland and Corinne Gaines and so many different folks dying. But I think a lot of folks saw it in 2020 with George Floyd, and then others saw it with January 6th and the white supremacist riot at the U.S. Capitol, is that we are right there in the thick of things. We're right there with Frederick Douglass. We are right there. And that's scary. That's exhilarating. It's exhilarating, but it's also scary because our lives are in danger, including us, right? Our life, everybody here gets death threats. Everybody on this panel gets death threats and hate email and saying all kinds of crazy things that they would do to us. So I've chosen to say, look, I want to write about this. I want to write about America's third Reconstruction. A nightmare is still a dream, and what does that mean? And that's what we are in. We're, that's what's going on, and that's actually the title of my book. But a nightmare is still a dream. But in fact, all you folks here, you're all going to have to blurb that.
It's a powerful title.
Yeah, I'm gonna be sending it your way.
Well, thank you all so much. This was a real treat for me to be able to engage in conversation with you all. And the other thing I would say to our audience, as we talk about, again, supporting Black leadership, I think it's also important that we support our Black scholars, that we read the books that you all write, and that we engage in conversations, whether that's setting up book clubs, in our own neighborhoods. I think this is really, really important. And I would encourage you all to get all of the authors' books and really engage with them, follow them on social media, because they do so much important work. So thank you all for your time. I really appreciate it. Thank you.